Oh, jeez, what happened? It's weird. Well, hold on a second, guys. I'm trying to figure out some of this stuff. Hey, Gold, what's going on, dude? I messed with my sound on my computer. now, now I can't hear this if it's playing or not. It's so weird. Like, I had it going. It was good. Oh, man. Oh, well. I will just have to back it out. Just give me a second, dude. Just here. Alright, cool. At least I figured that out. How's your day going, man? How's it been? About to play some Uno. Unless you're up to playing something else, dude. Let me know. Let's see. How's your day going, Equals? What's up, man? Life happening or what? Just gotta log into things. Get this game running. Equal, what's going on, dude? You were there. I know you were. Hi's here. I'm still alive. For now. You know? Let's see, dude. I don't want to leak my account with Steam. Maybe I don't. Maybe I don't want to leak my Uno. This is why I put stream starting soon. Cause you never know. Let's see. Display capture. It's magical. Equal, what's going on, dude? Welcome, man. Welcome back to the stream as my hand phases in and out. How's your day going, man? How goes thyself? Are you improving yourself day by day? Are you slowly dying like the rest of us? Okay. Start off with some Uno. I don't have any friends to play Uno with, but if you want to come play Uno, that'd be amazing. Oh. What in the actual Uno? That's a good question, dude. Hold on. Apparently my Uno decided to work now. No, wait, hold on. What's capturing this then? So confused right now. What is going on? How's this displaying? Okay, well it's displaying, but why is it not displaying? Okay, oh. I hit the wrong thing. I just closed it out myself. Hey, don't judge me, guys. All right, I might be a dork, but come on. Oh, jeez, man. Freaking crazy. How's your day going, though? I'm doing good. I got done with homework at a pretty good time, I say, today. I had like one topic of math, and I got it finished. It was doing dimensional analysis. Sounds super fancy, but it's practically just taking, like, say there's a mile of a race course, but they only want to put a flag every 160 yards, right? So you have to transfer the miles into yards and then how many flags per yard, right? So they want you doing fractions though. I don't know why. They want you doing fractions. It drives me nuts. Whatever. We'll take it. I think they fixed Chroma Cam because now I see that pops up the little watermark every once in a while, which is slightly annoying to be honest. But do I really want to pay for the one that doesn't pop up all the time? Like, it looks nice. It's nice not have that green screen behind me, but at the same time, like, the quality of the actual green screen is quite a bit better, you know? So, I don't know if you're just chilling and lurking. Hey, what's up, Equal? What's going on, man? I've been sitting here talking to you this whole entire time. Just so you know. I was like, where did Equal go? He popped in here for a second and go, what's going on, man? How's your day? Let me just send this message, real quick. Let's see. Wow, ambitious. I have some ideas. But man, how's your day? Nah, I didn't get green screen. It's been a bit. It's called Chroma Cam. What it does is it takes the background around me and it edits it out. So you're seeing in real time, what the camera is doing. But in reality, there's nothing behind me. I can turn it off real quick, but that'd be more of a pain than you think. But no, man, you've been missing MIA for a little bit, but I made affiliate. That's freaking dope. So thank you for the follow, because it helped out a lot, man. You really did. You really helped me get to that point, man. So you can subscribe whenever you feel like it. You know, it's optional. I care if you subscribe, because that's amazing. But if you can't subscribe, it's fine. I know a lot of people. Why do I got 3? What? Oh, I think this is a promotion. Oh yeah, the news. I don't know how to get rid of the news. It just sits there. Now it gets rid of it, but it doesn't actually get rid of it. Maybe we should do some online play. But yeah, dude, it's just a Chroma Cam. You've been good. I've been fine, dude. I have this semester's school next week. The end of next week, I'm done with school until next semester starts, which I have to get going on what college. I'm gonna transfer because I've been doing it all online and find out it's like I've been struggling a little bit because everything's not set up quite the same, so you can miss stuff. But anyways, what have you been up to, man? How's life over there? See, it's not Canada, right? You're in Israel, right? I'm sitting here, I'm pretty sure he's in Israel, and my brain is farted. I don't know. So, alright, let's get started. Let's play some wonderful, amazing Uno. I don't have money, I wish I could sub. Oh, thanks, though. I'll seriously take it. But look, I gotta show off my corgi shirt, alright? This is goofy, but I love this thing. So I got a corgi riding a T-Rex. Can't remember who got it for me. Sam did. Sam got it for me. You gotta get a girlfriend like Sam, because she'll get you goofy, corny, stuff. Life is stressful, and yeah, and you do. Gotcha. Alright. I mean, when is life not stressful, right? Yeah, it's a classic match. I'm gonna play some Uno and enjoy this. Man, this Uno is crazy, dude. I was legitimately having a hard time. I was playing with some friends, and I was like this close to winning, and then I got all the cards. I was freaking raving. I'm gonna clip it, and so you can see it. But see, let's join the match and do it. So I'm happy I remembered it. Unable to connect. Looks like you're unable to connect the host. Please check your network and try again later. I don't know what's going on. Join a match. That's weird. I mean, I don't think there's anybody to join. I thought it'd be... here, maybe I'll just host a match. Maybe if I create a match, I'll do it. But... oh, wait, did I get new cards? Did I get new cards? Let's see if I got new cards. Oh, I did! I got Rabbids. That's a little crazy. Is Uno free? I wish Uno was free. It's $10. $10 for Uno. Cause I mean I would gift it. This is fun. I really 1 run, 200. I don't know. Let's play 200. Force play. Wild draw force may be played without being challenged. I want you to bluff me. Just bluff me. Yeah, man. Uno's only $10. What's this? I'll play swap hands. I don't want to swap no hands. I'll just play like this. You have to unlock that. Okay. Well, yeah, dude. My brain is farting. Anyways, that's what's been going on in my life. I wish Uno was free because I have you hop in here in a hot second. I'll be like, oh, my Nats. Okay. I didn't think I changed it. What's going on? 40 for you. If I could send you 10, if it was $10, I would send you $10, dude. I would totally have you hop in. You're like, it's 40 though. Can I gift it to you? Technically, I could gift it to you, right? I bought it here and then do I have you on Steam? It's on Steam. Where's Steam at? There's Steam. Steam. Yeah, Eagle. Let me see if I can add you for Steam, and I'll send you it that way to you. Yeah, yeah. Hop in Discord, dude, and send me a friend request, or give me your name on Steam. Oh, that was me. I'm special. Yeah, Eagle, hop on Discord real quick and send it to me. And then I'll send you Uno, dude. You can play some Uno. Oh no, oh no. Alright, what is going on? Why can't I see any of these? Oh, there he goes. Disable this, dude. Yeah, I've gone through a lot since I got a new monitor too. So I have a second one. Friggin' dope. See what else did I do? Yeah, you can let me know, man. And I can't host. I don't know why I can't host. I'm not. I didn't think I had anything on. Nothing out of the ordinary, you know. Don't gift it. It would be a bad thing. Oh, why would it be a bad thing? Hey, Santa, what's up, yo? 200 bits, hell yeah, rise and shine, boys. I mean, it's 5:30. Where you been, Santa? Kevin play. It's like 2 a.m. for me. I need to be asleep. Oh, well, thanks for stopping in, Nicole. I'm trying to move my times a little bit more. I'm hoping I can at least get earlier stream, so it's not 2 a.m. We can do later. Go back to sleep. Go back to sleep, Equal. I'll play later and you can hop in. But let me get your Steam numbers. What's up? You're sheepless? You're sheepless? Oh my gosh, Santa. Dude, you can't. Yeah, dude. Playing some Uno, man. At least trying to. For some reason, I have my NAT set for strict right now, so I have no clue how to change that right now. Because that's my advanced gamer setup I have. But dude, what's up? I'm like never even here. Dude. I know, man. We gotta get you back in here. That's why you said it's 2 a.m. for you, right? So I need the setup thing. I need to think of something so that I can set my schedule better. Set my schedule better so you can hop in here more times. But not. Been wanting to play COD with you too. But Zenith, what you up to, man? Can't have some strange dreams, so no time for sleep. Have no time for sleep because you don't want to stream. Confused. Are you awake right now? But Zenith, what are you up to, man? You about to hop in some Uno with me? I got these little sticky pads. I'm trying to write down notes and trying to think of stuff. I'm about to hop back into my solo Rust server and grind a few hours out before I lose track of time and fall back to sleep. Dude, take a break, man. You're gonna die. You're gonna die of rust in your system, bro. And then it's 2 a.m. for you. That's like 5 p.m. for us. It's like a whole 12-hour difference. It's more than 12-hour difference. It's less than 12-hour difference because 5 to 5 would be 12, but 5 to 2 would be only 8. It's still a lot of a difference. That's a hell of a difference. But let me try to figure out why this is not doing what it should be supposed to be doing. So. Okay, have a nice day. I just came to see what's up and talk. I think I'm gonna go sleep since have a nice day and good stream. Thank you, Eagle. Seriously, dude. I hope you have some nice sleep, and I'll catch you later, man. Take it easy. Not streaming anytime soon either. Just trying to play games for fun after a 24-hour one. It's seeming more and more like a job. Zenith, where you have been, man? That's all streaming is. It's fun. I enjoy the hell out of it. Don't get me wrong, but it's work, dude. You don't get anywhere in streaming if you're not working, dude. I'm hoping I can host a game. I was hoping I can host one, and I'm having issues hosting. And when it let me hop in, it said, "Yes, it looks like you're unable to connect to the host. Please check your network and try again later." So do I need to set my network settings differently? That's why I'm confused. No, I don't want controller. I don't care about the controller. You guys should play with the Xbox controller. Alright, settings. Resolution. No, it doesn't let me do any of that, man. I have no clue why it's not letting me play Uno with people. Besides, my NAT is set to strict, which I don't have my NAT set to strict. It should be normal. I don't know how to change that with my PC. Alright, I'll just play some Uno. Solo match. Go. Dude, I unlocked new cards too, man. Right game. I'm just gonna play against AIs. So if people show up. Zenith's over here dying. A 24-hour stream, dude. It was so like last second, dude. It wasn't funny. But look, I got pie. Delicious pie. I think I switch over to COD. When a draw 2 or wild draw 4 is played, you may play them. Oh yeah. Why is it telling me this now? Hey, what's up, Seahorse? How you doing? Welcome in. I'm still trying to figure out the name. We can call it the Dragon's Cavern right now, or the Cozy Dragon's Den. Actually, I'm starting to warm up to Cozy Dragon's Den. But hey, welcome to the Cozy Dragon's Den. What's going on? Enjoying some nice, tasty pie. Which is more cream than it is pie. I don't know why I just skipped. Should just use it too. Seahorse, things going a little bit better for you today? At least not friends-wise, but at least life. place a 2 down. So, what? It's yours. What? Yeah, no, my messages made you feel worse. I just want to make sure my point's across to you. Because these are things you have to think about before you just decide to hop in and stuff. You're also feeling sick earlier? You sent me messages back? Okay. I'll take a look at them. I don't know when you sent them, but I don't know what messages you read. That's the question. So I sent some a while ago, and I felt like I never got a response for it. So I'm enjoying my pie. It's delicious. Why is this rolling like it is? This is messed up. Why can I not scroll through this easily? Well, I read, yeah, I see they read all of them now. But. Oh, I have any cards. Okay. Now it's not sitting here trying to make you feel guilty for the way Frame feels, or guilty for handing a present to someone. That's fine. That's all in power. I'm just saying your actions that you make, right, do have consequences for them. And because the consequences was Frame no longer wanting to be your friend or no longer want to talk to you, that's a consequence you have to deal with. Because you haven't told me, and I only know so much details from what you told me, but I have to assume or have to make an educated guess is the better part of it, an educated guess on what you and Frame talked about. Ooh, I just got him a +2. So that makes it difficult for me to sit here and say, Seahorse was doing this with pure intentions. She sent Caleb a gift because she generally was just being nice, which is what you were doing, right? Yeah, either way you have consequences, good or bad consequences. We'll just leave it there. But I'm losing my mind because I'm trying to say that, like, if you feel guilty for anything, what does that say to you about your actions? Do you feel guilty because Frame pointed it out? Or are you feeling guilty because I pointed something out and you hadn't thought about it? Because in the end run, like, I'm not there. I can't save you. I can't save you for the consequences. I like to say, like, I want you and Frame. Oh man, this guy's about to win Uno. I hope he doesn't win. I don't want to skip Dusty because it won't make any sense. Oh, but he skipped him. Yes, nice. All right. Uno. Yes. But okay, he couldn't go. All right. So, anyways, it's yours. Frame made his own decisions. He made his decision to talk to you, and now he's heartbroken over it. No biggie. Oh, what? I tried to hit Uno. Let me hit Uno. My intention with the gift of Caleb was just make him happy and stuff. My intention in not giving Frame a gift was because I didn't want to make him fall for me more because gifts from someone like you have effect. My intention was trying not to hurt him, but I did. Skip that. Yeah, so I know you were trying not to hurt him, and I appreciate you for telling me, and it just sucks that you did, unfortunately. because you were talking to Frame for a while. So in his way, he probably values gifts a lot. So when you give Caleb a gift and you didn't gift him one, he was like, well, do you even consider me a friend still? Like, but he just sounds just as needy for attention as you are. But you have to admit, I'm an attention whore too, okay? Like, so I like it when you hop in here and come talk to me, okay? I'm so screwed. It did not give me any good cards in this. Anyways, I'll take a second because I can wait. But oh yeah. I mean, I'm not needy for attention. Cough, cough, cough. Here you go. There you go. Corgi riding a T-Rex. That's my attention seeking right there. To have you look at my shirt. No, there's a lot. Everybody wants a little bit of attention. If that's no attention, that's still attention. Oh man, they just screwed me over. But I keep getting off sidetrack. Wow, such a beautiful shirt. That's not a beautiful shirt. It's a freaking gorgeous shirt, alright? A corgi gorgeous shirt, alright? Get that right, seahorse. Easier way to distract me there, right? Commenting on this beautiful, gorgeous shirt, right? I mean, I don't drive off attention. I like it, but I don't love it, like some people. So, I get what you're saying. If you take attention, you'll take the attention. But you're not driving to have attention. I mean, let me put it this way. Some part of us wants a little bit of attention. A little bit of our survival instincts kicks in and says, if we're not getting attention from other people, there's a part of us that isn't accepted by, you know, the people we hang out with. That's what I mean by attention. I mean, down deep, like, there's a part of you that understands if you're getting attention from somebody, regardless of who it is, you're still being accepted into that little fold, you know? So, that's why you gotta keep in mind, that's why Frame's hurt, because he didn't get that little bit of attention from you that you have been giving him this whole entire time. So he feels hurt you haven't gone in and said something, you know? Or give them a gift. I mean, always Frame drives off attention though. Yeah. So, like I said, it's a lot of it's Frame's fault. I just want you to understand that your reactions to that. Should I challenge this guy? Because if I challenge him and he doesn't have any greens, then I win. But if if he doesn't have any greens, and I challenge him, he wins. If I challenge him and he has a green, I lose. But this is a bot, and I don't think they ever actually bluff. So I'm just gonna keep going, and I'm gonna have to take 4 cards. That's why he started liking you in the first place, guys. If you haven't already figured it out, a lot of guys like a lot of attention. It is what it is. So try to keep that in mind. That's why I brought all this up. I'm like, I'm telling you your actions have consequences, because the fact that people do have those sets, they are driven off of attention. Some who aren't driven off attention, and you're sitting here say you're not paying attention to one person, they're fine with it. They don't care if you're not paying attention to them. But but as soon as you show attention to someone else, maybe they want some of that attention. Because unfortunately, they want some attention. No, I lost where I'm gonna disregard all that. You turn it yellow, I don't have anything. I just collected 14 cards and all this talking. 3. But I don't know. I'm just let Frame do what he needs to do. If he wants to come back and be your friend, then be your friend. But don't feel too shy to not, message him first in the future. I would give him a week, at least a week or more. I don't know what you plan on doing, Caleb, but I'm gonna challenge this because I'm either way. I'm gonna. No, I just gained 6 cards. It's gonna be different though. What do you mean it's gonna be different? Sitting there reading. Freaking dying right now. Alright, don't judge me. Home run. 14 is following. Thank home run. Appreciate the follow. I'm sitting here missing stuff somehow. I don't know how in the world. I think I know where home run is from. But I don't know why I didn't see his follow pop up. Because I guess it technically is. Yo, I don't do that pick me or them kind of thing. Yeah. I know what you mean. I don't like picking people. Damn, come on. It's cars, they're being finicky. But you mean do you ask people to pick me or you think? Or you like when someone asks you to do that, you're like, nah, I'm walking out. I'm done. I'm not gonna do that. Here, I wanna reverse this. I hope this I don't know why I reversed this guy. He's like, oh yeah, I love reds. Give me all the reds. I can't. These bots are messing me up, man. How can you do this to me? Let's see. Oh, I could have skipped that guy. My brain is farting. Oh well. No LMO. What do you mean no LMO? A llama? No llamas in this house? No llamas in this house. No llamas in this house. Just Bacchus is just Bacchus. This guy is damn necessity to get Uno. Hang on, I'm just gonna keep skipping. As long as I can. Ooh. No llamas in this. No, there's definitely a bunch of llamas in this house. I'm a llama lover. You can't deal with this llama. Just keep skipping this Uno guy. Probably if I didn't skip, he would actually draw something. You know what? No, because he might challenge me. Oh, it sucks. It's a robot. Yes. Oh, come on. He got blue on the first draw. Come on. Oh, they skipped me. Oh, got him. Yes, nice. It's the first time I've seen him being able to grab him before he said Uno. Oh, so you can only call Uno when it's your turn, and the other person hasn't done it yet. Huh. I'm learning this game on this damn computer. You think I've played it multiple times before? Like, all my childhood to play this game? I guess the big problem here is that I got over my feelings quicker than he did. Yeah. Well, I can't say anything about your feelings, because our friends' feelings. I would just chalk it up to... He's got Uno. I hate that he has Uno. And I can always put down. No, it doesn't work in my favor at all. I'm just going to put down the 4. I was going to give the 1 card more times than he did. I think most guys, to be honest, in some sets take longer to get over something than women do. But I don't think that's true. I think it's more like everyone's different. Everyone has a different opinion about things, or feelings about things. So he probably fell harder than he let you know. No, 2 cards. Why? I'm gonna start raging at this damn game. It's freaking driving me nuts. Sam says she loves me. She's on break. Let's say I love you more, babe. Oh, I didn't know she went live. Oh, what's going on? But, what are you doing right now, Seahorse? What's going on? I hope you're feeling better. How sick are you? Like, cough, like, I don't want to go to school sick, or like, cough, I'm gonna go throw myself in the toilet sick. You know what I mean? Your daughter says she loves you. Why are you saying in third person? It makes me concerned. Oh man. Love you too, daughter. Let's see what Linda Puppy's doing. Oh. Well, thanks for the host. What? I didn't know she was hosting me. Oh, no, I messed up. Hey, I went to the... No, she's not hosting me. I'm a dork. That's what it is. I don't know a lot about stacking. I didn't go to your last two classes because you weren't feeling it. So, did we just start a new game? And yeah, we started. Ugh. Sam says lies. Lies to loving her. I can't. Sam's at work right now. She's working at Bevmo, that liquor store business. So yeah, Lomo, how did you know? I did not know about the party. Oh, she loves me the mostest. Lots of mostest love. See, I'm gonna save this. I'm gonna save this special card. And see. Hold on. Yeah. Just gotta say hi. Let's play Fortnite. I'm kind of down to play some Fortnite, to be honest. Only problem was Sam stole my PlayStation. I was playing with the PlayStation. Yeah, it'll take me a second. Give me a second, I'll go grab it. Dude, this is the guy I want to beat right here. AI Dusty, let's go, dude. What the hell, man? So, give me a second. I'm gonna finish this game real quick, and then I'll go steal the PlayStation, and we'll play some Fortnite. Sound good? Keep you busy. Keep you busy. Kinda want to just pull. There you go. I'd rather pull instead of having to worry about anything. You hear me, Seahorse? Fortnite party. Dude, why do I have to accept your card? No, too many cards. Oh, you heard me. Gotcha. Alright. Damn robots. The challenge. No! I'm losing this already! Why? Okay. I have no stuff. No worries for you. So Seahorse, when are you gonna get like an actual setup? You're using your laptop to watch me, or you're watching on your phone? Just try to figure out how to hook my pussy. Brain first. Aye! Why are you dropping things like that, huh? That's important. By the way, I'm yelling at myself, just so you know. Turn on your laptop. What type of laptop do you have, by the way, if you don't mind me asking? You going with Mac or like, you know, something cooler than a Mac? Alright. Thank you, doggo. You wanna say hi to Maple? No. What next? Can't hear you well now. That's because I was awake, but I was asking you, yeah, what type of laptop do you have? And then I said I wish I was 29. Yeah, I don't know if I want to even go through this. This is so lost. Scream. All the screams. Where's my controller at? Oh, Sam's got it. Oh, lay down. And I was asking if you want to say, no, I don't want to say hi to Maple. How dare you not say hi to Maple? He's the freaking darnest cutest thing in the world, alright? Can't believe you. I love you, daughter. I take it back on my love. All because you won't love my dog. Oh, yes. Love my dog. He's all tired. I'm be 27 in December. Too old. Oh. Make this guy pull his cards. Make him pull those cards. Gotta have everyone else have bigger ones. Yeah. What is it? What you want all my attention? Now you're just laying here. Oh, frame is 29? I don't know. I think frame wouldn't have that hard of an issue. What if they're gonna challenge me? He just challenged me. No! Why? This computer's fight unfair. Push down. Push you down. Let me go grab my controller. Because apparently I forgot Sam grabbed it. It's all Sam's fault. Hey, where are you? Stole my heart, babe. Where are you? Alright. I saw your face. You gave a cringy face. Cringy face when I said what? I don't know. I swear that every time this watermark pops up, I'm gonna murder somebody right now. That's the cringe face I made. Oh, I'm so done. I'm so done. You're lucky. You're lucky that I'm losing this game right now. I think he doesn't have any to lose. That's why it's red right. Can I help you? You're cute. Ugh. I'm raging at this game right now. That's what's going on. So I was right. I was right when I placed blues down. Let's see. Fine, we'll reverse it, because this guy's gonna win. Skipped him. 6. This is a talent that you're bad at, you know? I mean, I was winning. Well, I mean, it's not a bad thing, because I technically won a couple games the other night. You know, so you can judge as you want, alright? Oh, Secret Santa gift exchange. We missed you guys the day of the exotic festival. We got them. They added Corgi Race. Oh, it's cute. The Corgi Christmas party held by Corgi Rescue here? Aww. Oh. All eyes. All eyes, Sam. Don't believe it. Alright, so I mean, I lost most of the games, alright? Doesn't mean anything. It's just not my day. I give this guy 2 cards. They're all playing strategically, alright? I just wanted to enjoy the game and, you know, at least win a few. They're like, nah, bro, we're just gonna smash it. We're gonna smash all of it. Alright, let's hope this works because I haven't used my 4K capture since Pokemon capture card. And it's deciding to load slowly. Ooh. Alright, I know you're there. Come on. Why is it not showing up? Why did you break my... I might have to actually hook up another HDMI cable. Now that I thought about it. Do I have one available is the question. Aha! I do. I have another one available. I think that the... Oh, that or it's just freaking out. I don't understand what's going on. I might have to update. That's a good question. I might have to update. Oh, you mean I have to update Fortnite? I'll die, dude. Don't kill me like that. Device, move. I don't know what's going on. Fortnite had an update a week or two ago. I don't think. How you doing? He's driving me nuts right now. I don't know why this is using my webcam. Losing my mind right now. Trying to figure out why this is not going. Oh, it should work without it. I don't know why it's not working. Okay, you're sitting on my... Off. Don't tell me I have to really go through this. I'm struggling right now. Alright. I thought I just saw it for a second. Is it at least capturing the sound? That'd be nice to know. And my dog's sitting on the wire for my controller, so. Be mad if I had to get rid of my... You can't use the extra... I have 2 oh. Guys, I'm dying here. Someone help save me. I'll just keep playing Uno for right now. So I can figure this out. This is what happens when you ask for things. Maybe you should just download Fortnite. How big is a Fortnite update? Alright, how big is Fortnite in general? Cause I have some room on my hard drive, but I don't wanna go that far. Let's see. Let's just reverse this. Probably think too far in Uno, and that's why I lose Uno. I don't think at all. Maybe we should do drunk Uno. The update for Epic Games. Ugh, that hurts. Alright, well that's updating, cause, you know, everything has to update. You in a game right now? Should I work on my eyebrow? Wave? Alright, let's do this Uno. What's going on? So, they reversed it. Let's go back to this guy. No! You're going down, dude! AI Dusty? Oh, you turned it green. Is that the right call to do, dude? I don't got any greens, man. Do blue. Probably gonna lose this because I just turned to blue. No! Good call. Haven't been paying attention to what cards he puts down. Okay. Don't judge me. Still updating Epic Games. Like, I can just download Fortnite and not have an issue every day. Oh, I clicked the wrong stuff and goes. Albert game on point. You guys ready for this? Let's see. Dying inside. Don't remind me. Don't care about all these notifications. Epic Games, thank you for spamming them to me. It's an amazing thing. I will forever not want to be spammed. Really confused why my capture card isn't working technically. Oh, you know what? I think Sam did something. I think Sam did something. That's why it's not working. Which means I have to do some finagling. I'm gonna cry right now. Title Goose. I don't care about Title Goose. Games. Store. Fortnite. Fortnite. No, I own it. We download Fortnite. Install. Question: do I have room for Fortnite? It doesn't even tell me what size Fortnite is. It just tells me. Well, we're at 1% for Fortnite right now. How much does it need? 33 gigabytes? It's only 33 gigabytes. I guess that's not too bad. I hate it though, because I need lots of stuff. OBS browser. It keeps cutting in and out. I don't know what it is. I do not like it. Oh, I do not. I am gonna leave. I'm gonna leave you guys. Life. Oh, ow, ow, I'm down. Somebody save me. Hi, Maple. How you doing? How you doing, Maple? How you doing? I'm gonna turn this off. He's standing on me like, oh. Alright, 2 gigabytes out of 33, so it's gotta be a little bit, unfortunately. Let's see. The dog is on my legs. Somebody save me. Oh, I got him. Got him. Got him. Got him. I'm gonna play with the dog for a little bit. He's suffering. He's suffering some no attention. Oh, oh, that hurt. Suffering from attention loss. Did you really bring that back in here? He brought Sam's boot back into the room. She has like this fuzzy Ugg that he just like brought back in the room. I can't even believe him right now. Come on, why? Oh, jeez. Oh, that's tears. You got stuff on your eyeball. Lyric, where are you, dude? I haven't seen you popped in yet, man. Yeah, man. Let's see. I'm gonna put 8 down real quick. And it's still downloading. Every time I look at it, it gets faster, but as soon as I look away, it slows down. We're changing back to red, because... Oh no! Why? You had to beat me like this. Oh. Hey, Maple. Hey, Maple. How you doing down there? Cutie, huh? Cutie patootie? Yeah? Yeah. Let's quit out this game. Trying to download this while streaming is probably pretty, nauseous. Anyways, how are you guys going? We're just gonna change this to just chatting, because just chat, you know? Let's see. Hell yeah, rise and shine. We can Zenith the top of the list right now for all the cheers he's been doing. He got 400 bits of cheers. Dude. 400 bits. It's biddies. Why do we have to live in a world full of bits? I'm just kidding. Oh yes, it's so cute! It's so cute! Why are you so cute, Maple? Why are you so cute? Why do you have to be so cute? Yes. Haha. I distracted you long enough so I can steal this. Ooh! Oh, jeez, man. So, yeah, anyways, my day's been pretty good. I've been enjoying life. I have crazy luck in D&D, and D&D will be this Thursday. We're gonna do D&D this Thursday. And my classes end next week. Friday will be my last one. I can see something in my beard. I'm trying to get at me now. But, hope Larry stops in so I can say hi, and hopefully he has a better day, too. Where you at, man? Come get some love. Here. Your Corga Dad. Oh, attacking the Corgi. Attacking the Corgi. Why? This is supposed to be at work right now. You're attacking me. How dare you? Okay. Oh, you missed it. You missed it. Too slow. Too slow. Too slow. Oh. Good job. Nice catch. Nice catch. So I just got just chatting. Yeah. Changed. Changing the nips, man. This is good music right here. Take your heart away. Daydreamer. I think it's mine in this game. In the world for me. Daydreamer. Let my heart away. Miles away. I dream of never bother you. I dream of miles away. Miles away. Dream of myself away. We're sitting at 10 gigabytes out of 33. We're getting there. Just gotta stare at it hard enough. I dream of myself away. That's what I was gonna do. Myself away. Why does this say Call of Duty over here? I forgot what it really was. It's his casting voice. Put us away. A dreamer. Daydreamer, and my heart away. Daydreamer, put your heart away. Rahala, oh no. Dreamer, let my heart away. Dreamer, put your heart away. So it's still going for a bit. Oh man, seriously? Oh, that's why. Maple's attacking me! Somebody help me! It's the attack of the Maple! He's going! He's going! He's gone! There we go. Alright, backing it up. Got him! Got him! Got him! Oh, you're such a serotonin release. Why are you so cute? Somebody save my dog. He doesn't know how to live. Ah, okay. Oh yeah? Oh yeah? That's so cute. That's so cute. Yeah, we're at 35% right now. 35%. Oh, you're so cute. You're so cute. Let's play a game that's off the grid for right now. Maybe it's something I haven't played in a while. Untitled Goose Game. I think that's all downloaded. This game was making me rage the other day. I was like, what the earth is this? Why can I not do this and why can't I do that? Got him. I got him right where I need him. I got him right where I need him. I got him right where I need him. It's gone. Vamoose. Doggo. Goose Game's back in business. Nope. You mess with the goose, you get the honk. The honky donk. Oh. Yeah. Feel alive. Feel alive. Oh no, that's not what I want. That's the scaling I want. Get out of there. Why? There we go. Find us. Na 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 na. Find us. Keep blowing up. I keep blowing up. Yeah. Keep you out of my life. I keep showing up. You keep showing up. Oh yeah. Oh, that's right. Like this. I forgot all the controls for this. For a second. Yeah, get in there. Get in there. Fight your way. Fight your way. There you go. You're the indestructible goose. Why? Leave me alone, dude. Don't worry about me, man. Just back off, alright? We need to make the man go barefoot. Do the washing. Okay. So, I don't remember how to make him go barefoot. Oh yeah, you just need to make him chase you. That's right. Okay. I'm gonna tab out of this. And just go. Get in this water. Look at that swimming. You got skills, guys. Skills for days. Oh. Let's see. Is it right click? It's right click. Oh. She's like, what? Ah. Don't mess with the goose. Don't mess with the goose. I'll give you all the goose. Yeah, that's what I thought. That's what I thought. You mess with the goose, you get the foof. Oh no, come on. Pick up the bra. Pick up the bra. Come on, Ty. Run! Run, Ty, run! Run! No, she got it. No. I'm so sad. So sad right now. Watch, we're gonna steal this. We're gonna hop it over here. Okay, come on. Let's grab this. Let's go. Run, Ty, run! Run, Ty, run! Don't let her take it. Don't let her take it. It's mine. How dare you? Oh yeah, I forgot. We just no, I don't care about that. We gotta set this up. Whew. Man, it's such shoddy work right there. So shoddy. Yeah, you should have fixed it better. That's your fault. Yeah, I'm the mean goose. I'll take it out. All right. We gotta go hide. We gotta hide. I forgot how to zoom out. It's A to zoom out. Okay. I don't see her. Where's she at? Is she gonna come back this way or what? I don't want her to see me with a bra. Oh, okay. She's busy with the goose. I mean yeah. We'll say the goose. I like how she's so mean to this goose, but yeah. Alright. You gotta be very careful. This guy's a douche. If he sees me, he's gonna take it back. Well, he'll throw them all back over the freaking Alright. So, did that count for the bra? Yes, got the count for the bra. Nice. Let's see, I'm trying to do this fast. Let's see. Yeah, I wonder if anyone's speed ran, hey! Get out of my way! Get out of my way! What do you want from me, eh? What do you want from me? I'm just a goose trying to live his life. A goose trying to live his life, alright? You're not gonna catch up to me? I'm too quick. I'm lightning McQuickies. She's more worried about the fence than she is about... Yes, let's get it. Let's get it, guys. Come on. So slow there. So slow. Let's see if we can put it over here. And the more stuff I mess with, the more I'm hoping that she doesn't realize I took it. Go looking for it. Go looking for it. Who gives a crap? Who gives a crap? Just go find them. I don't see you looking enough around. Oh no, she's coming this way. Can I help you? Can I help you? Yeah, that's what I thought. Alright, we gotta go. We gotta make it back. We gotta climb. We gotta climb. Come on. Oh no. Oh, I'm gonna make it. I'll make it. Oh yeah, I just made it. Yep, outside out of mind, bitch. Yeah, I'm in. I'm mad like that. I mean. Dude, just read your newspaper. Oh, come on. I have to wait until he moves, man. Let's see where the... Oh, did it finally download? I don't see where Epic Games is at right now. It must have downloaded. I'm like, I don't see it. I don't see it on the... I don't see it on my up on my window. So it must have downloaded finally. No, it's still working on it. It's paused right now. I don't know why it paused. Maybe I accidentally clicked out of it. Oops. Sorry, Seahorse! Just trying to get over there. Okay. Oh, no, oh, he almost caught me. He almost caught me. Can't let him see. Alright. Woo! Can't let this guy get me. Do I have to get both pairs of socks? A pair of socks, yeah, it does. Okay. Let's see. Alright. I wonder if she's gonna hear this and come this way. Because I don't want her to. Ah, come on. Get a sock. Get a sock. Look, this is the best way to go about it. He doesn't see you. You still make the sock over. Alright, hold on. What do you got? We need a pair of slippers and a bar of soap. Okay. So the slipper is gonna be the hardest one to do. But we'll save that one for last, because the slippers are the one that the guy's wearing. And the bar of soap. She's wondering what the hell happened. I'm like, it's not my fault. I didn't do anything. Don't look at me. Jeez. So bossy. Get out of here. Get out of here. Get out of here. Don't make me honk this guy. Don't make me honk this guy. Oh, he got honked. He got honked real hard. Oh, just made it through. Nice. Oh, I didn't know I could hide there. Alright. Soap is now in the pond. I don't know how I'm gonna get this guy to give up his slippers. I forgot how to bend down. Is it control? It's control, okay. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Let's go. Let's go. What are you gonna do, dude? What are you gonna do? Do the washing. Nice. Oh no. Oh no. No, oh no. What are you gonna do, dude? Oh. Come on. Come on. Let me get your other slipper. Let me get your other slipper. Let me get your other slipper. Let me get... You can't fight me. You can't fight me. I'm the goose police. Oh. Oh. No, guys. Come on, Goose. You can do the business. You can do the business. Oh, okay, fine. 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 Did I not? Oh, this is Make a Man Go Barefoot. I was hoping that I could get it. Ah, man. Go barefoot. Take off your shoe, bro. Take off your shoe. Aha. Took the cup. Drop it over here. You gotta rage all night, guys. It's not funny. This man loves the stuff, you know? Yeah. What are you gonna do about it now? What are you gonna do about it now? Oh, no. No. Whack you over the head. That's what's gonna happen. Don't goose with me, buddy. Don't goose with the goose. See, he needs to go barefoot though, so that means I have to do all of them. Oh, what the? Oh, he saw the fence. No, you have to fix that fence. Oh, sorry, dude. I didn't mean to walk in there. I'm just minding my own business, man. I'm minding my own business, man. Oh, okay. This is too fun. Now he's gonna go for the soap. I don't know if he still hasn't got a soap yet. Let's see. I don't want to do. Guys, help me out here. What should I do next? I know I need to go with his shoes, but Fortnite is what I want to play, and it's still downloading. It's a freaking long download for no reason, in my opinion. Maybe if I hide behind this bush long enough, I can grab the other shoe. I don't know if he's gonna get the other shoe. Yeah, he got his other shoe back. So how do I get both shoes then? How do I get both shoes if it gets both of them off? He's gotta pick up his cough though. I'm not doing anything, I'm just sitting here. Don't look at me like that. Jeez. These guys, suspicious and everything. You thought I did something in life, you know? Come on, dude. Put your guard down. Put your guard down. I don't got all day, man. I don't got all day. There you go. There you go. Alright, alright. We're gonna walk away. We're gonna walk away? We're gonna come back? Oh, come back? Maybe, oh, you know what? I figured out how to do it. I figured out how to do it. No! I figured out how to do it. I figured out how to do it. So what I gotta do is I gotta make him, I gotta grab his slipper and I have to run away with it. And I have to make it into the other yard. Which is a pain in the butt, because that means I have to juggle 2 people. Let's see. Let's see if I can do it, guys. Do you guys believe in me? I wonder why the goose is doing this to begin with. It's like torturing everybody. I wonder if there's another way over. Oh, man. Let me in! Let me in! She's like, leave that alone. Haha. Oh, dude. She hit me! Goose-a-boos! Goose-a-boos! Oh, run, Ty, run! I'm gonna wreak havoc in her yard. Alright, we're messing everything up. This is what we're gonna do. Come on. Come on. Oh, there we go. There we go. We're dragging everything around. We're messing with stuff. Who knows? Who knows what we're gonna do? We're a wild goose. We're a wild goose. He's like, I'm watching ya. I know you're watching me. I'm watching you too. Alright? Jeez, man. What's the word for it? Oh, come on. Alright, fine. Oh, I got the slipper. I got the slipper. I got the slipper. Oh yeah, hell yeah. Run, Ty, run. What's the soap doing all the way over there? Oh yeah. Oh, let go of it, Ty. Let go of it. She's gonna come for you. Oh. Come on, Ty. He's trying to find his slipper. Oh, that's funny. I can't even believe it right now. And I can. He's giving his slipper up for loss. Let's see. I just need to make him go barefoot, so. Run! He's staring at me. Oh no. Why can't I get his other slipper? How do I get his other slipper, guys? I got one of them. How do we get the other one? You just need to go barefoot, that's all. They didn't say how long you need to go barefoot. Is there an extra one yet? Nah, it's not an extra one. Yeah. Put your feet up, come on. Come on. No, your other foot. Your other foot. Man, this is such a hard game. This just shouldn't be like this. We're almost halfway, I think, with Fortnite download. Oh man, he's got the other foot up. No, he saw me as soon as I came around the corner. Oh, my bad, my bad, my bad. Figure out how I got the other one, but the accuracy of this beak is like non-existent. If you see me grab something and it's not the thing you think I was gonna grab, you're right. Oh, he saw me. He saw me. Let's keep an eye out. Yes, mother trucker. Alright. Oh, no. He's changed. Come on, dude. Drink your tea. No. I don't know how you're supposed to get him during his tea time. It's beyond me, man. You can't get it while he's standing on the slipper either, because it's too much weight. So I don't know. I'm dying here, guys. I'm freaking dying here. Oh, why? Why? Quack, quack, quack. Yeah, do your tea now. Do your tea. I don't know why he keeps rubbing his pants. Alright, hold on. He looks that way. Looks that way. Takes a sip of his cup. Why is he... Okay. Oh. Why can't I get a slipper? Give me your slipper! Damn. Sock hogger? Sock hogger? Oh, it's not what I want. Oh, almost had him. Oh, why? Is he looking at me? I think he's looking at me. I'm not doing anything? Oh. Every time I run into him, he knocks me away. Alright, well. I'm straight. That's the only thing I can think of is just waiting for him to put his foot up again. That's why. That's all. Okay, we're sitting at 54% with the download. Come on! Why do you only go fast when I'm looking at you? How am I supposed to live like this? Alright, this is a... I can do this, guys. Believe in me. I believe in the believes. You know? All the beliefs. I'm so close to getting the damn freaking slipper. Every time I go like this, though, I can't grab it here. Hello, my name's Quack. Okay. Nice, got it. Good, done. It's done for. This guy can't get me. He's a quack. I got another item on the list. Okay. Nice. I wonder what's on the list. Make someone prune the prize rose. Oh. How the hell do you do that? Oh. How would they prune the rose? Oh, that's gonna be a tough one. Alright. Run, Tyron! I'm gonna do it. I think she's the best one to have prune. The prize rose. How do you do it? That's the question. It's always a question. Never knowing what it could be. How? There's gotta be somehow to do it. I haven't watched this far, guys. Here, what if I keep doing this? Come on, come on. I won't go fast enough. Hey, we're at 58%! Yay! Okay, so we know we need that. We may need this. I think we need this. But I can't get from over this side, obviously. But Oh, what's this? What's this? What's this? What's going on with this? What's going on with this? Why can't I mess with this? It's a squirrel. Okay. What happens if I keep doing this? You guys, has anyone watched a goose? Let me know. I'm just confused as why they let you do that. Okay. So you whack that. She picks up the prune scissors and starts going to work on pruning. Okay. Is there something? I wonder. I haven't tried to mess with the rose before, so I don't know. So one thing I haven't done yet. I'm not doing anything. Oh, there we go. Ah, I did not know you could pull it over here. Alright. Nice. I figured it out then. Alright, that was easier than I thought it would be. Yeah, peck at it. Peck at it real good. Peck at it real good. Yeah. Keep going, Ty. Keep going. Keep going, Ty. Yeah. So she gets over here. She's still not paying attention. Beat this thing up. Beat this thing up. Do I have to like time it just right? That's the question. Are they gonna make me time it? I can't. Once you move it, you can't do it. Hold on. Let's see if she prunes it. I'm just gonna sit here and chill. We're at 61% for Fortnite. Yeah, for a 33 gigabyte upload or download, it's pretty crazy. Come on. Come on. Yes! Got it! I got it! I got it! Yes! What now? How do I get out of this place? Oh, what is she doing? What is she doing? What is she's... I love how the neighbors just... They just don't talk to each other. Oh, my bad. I clicked on the wrong thing. What is she doing? What is she doing? Oh, the no goose sign. Fine. Let me out of here. I just want to be free. Your tyranny. There you go. I thought you liked goose. Nice. Made it through, guys. Wow. I can't tell you how long that took me. I knew a little bit from the start, but because I streamed this before, but... Well, we're going to someone's house. That's what you get with messing with the goose. Mess with the goose, you get the honk. Nice. That's some mail. Okay. Yeah. We're gonna mix the mail. Why not? Nice. This is straight me. This is. You wonder why your mail got mixed up with? You thought I was supposed to be at your house? The goose did it. The goose is the one at fault. Ah, come on. I'm trying to get it closer. Oh well. Whatever. It's on your doorstep. That's all that matters. Messing things up. 101 the goose. 101. The first 101 on the goose is you don't mess with the goose. Number 2 is you don't mess with the goose. Number 3, you always mix with the goose and stuff. You don't mess with the goose and stuff. So, what's going on over here? Ah, now get into the pub, break the dartboard, get the toy boat, make the old man fall on his bum, be awarded a flower, steal a pint glass, and drop it in the canal. Set the table. Okay. So that's what we gotta do. I don't know when this Fortnite download's ever gonna end. Nobody likes a goose. Goose don't like you either. Yeah, that's what I thought. Scared of the goose. Well, I don't like goose either. Ooh, what's this? Does this has anything to do? Nothing that I know of yet. So we'll just drop it for now. I can't get in there. I'll pick this up though. What does this do? I do not know. That is the question. We shall figure it out, guys. We should figure out what's going on with Goose. Goose is Goose. Oh! Why? How dare you stare at me like that? Hey! Hey, I said get out of the way. Oh, nice! Will this get me in the pub though? I don't know, you can hop into the box. Ah. My beard is a little cheap, a little itchy. Yo, you guys gonna come get this box or what? How long do I have to wait? Aha! Didn't have to wait too long. This Goose is getting into this place, whether you like it or not. Oh no! He's got me. He's got me pegged. He's got me pegged. I can't get out. I can't get out. Can't get out. How am I supposed to get in there? Is there anything down here? Can I go this way? We're almost done with the Fortnite download. We get there. Oh, my bad. Can't believe this lady dropped me. Like, what the hell, dude? She mean. She mean, old lady. Oh. Oh, give me the box. Give me the box. Give me the box. So I tried hopping in this one. Nice. I don't know, let's try this one more time. Let's see if this will work. That's the question. 'Tis the question. Will this work, guys? I need your answer. This is gonna be the do it all out. Just hit my mouse. We're almost done. We're at 28 gigabytes with 33 gigabytes left. Come on down to the pound house. Alright, I'll be right back. More pie sounds good. I brought the pie. You bring the fun. Fun pie.
I got it bad for you. You give me good love. You're like a dream come true. They say it won't last. They say you're wild and free. I know you never were a one-man woman. I was hoping you would give that all up for me. I get so confused. I love it when it's only me and you. Doing all the things we know we shouldn't do. This is way too good. It can't be true. So tell me what your game is, girl. without you. I'm all up in my head when I'm without you. I start to lose my shit. I just been hurt before. Stranger's t-shirt on my bedroom floor.
Oh, what the hell? What the hell happened while I was gone? I made it this time? Should probably be quiet. No, they put me in. Oh, well. Did I make it? Yeah, I got into the pub. Yeah. I don't know what happened last time. I don't know why I didn't make it last time. That was weird. Break the dartboard. Get the toy boat. Touch me under something to entertain it. I'm a little bit suspicious. I don't know what I'm doing right now. I'm totally confused on what I'm doing. Okay, so break the dartboard, get the toy boat, make the old man fall on his bum, be awarded a flower, steal a pint glass and drop in the canal, set the table. Oh, I have to set a table. I need a knife, fork, plate, and pepper, and a candle. I don't know why this goose needs this, but we'll do it. What'll happen? Oh, this is the table. Haha. I got it. Some romantic candlelight under the table. Huh. So I know how. Well, I guess maybe I should just pick this up. Let's put it over here. We're almost done. We're at 79%. Suspicious. Oh, do you think I should hop up on the table? No. Oh, that's not the way to do it either. See what's over here. Oh, nice. Okay. How do I get over here? Or we just gotta follow her. It's like a little cutscene. It's like a little cutscene. Okay. But aha! This is how you do it. You down. She doesn't know where I went. She doesn't know where I went. She can't see me. She can't see me. I'm too short. Oh no. Oh no. She's gonna get me. She's gonna get me. I can't turn very fast. No. No. You can't get me. You can't get me. Aha. My life will not be controlled by you, human. Oh. Yeah. Okay. Well. Okay, there we go. Gotta set this table, guys. I don't know why, but we're gonna set this table. It's the only way to get through the game. Nice. Put it right on the plate. Oh. She might see me. Better hide. I'm surprised this lady didn't come back with something new. I'll block that up, to be honest. You're gonna get hard. Peppercorn. Come on. Come on, this controls are a little hard. Oh, there's the toilet boy. Okay, I see it. Dive. Oh, guys, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna win. I'm gonna get it. Oh. Don't judge me, alright? A goose has gotta do what a goose gotta do, okay? Yeah, I don't know what a goose would want with it either. Just missing a candle. I don't know why I had to get a toy boat, to be honest. That's the one thing that doesn't make any sense. Because it doesn't have like a clear end goal. Oh! I can make him fall on his bum! Ah. I don't know how you're supposed to break the dartboard, that's weird. I'm a goose, don't worry about me. Alright? I got it! I got it! Your harmonica is mine! Oh! Oh. This lady just let me in. She just doesn't care. Go make him fall on a bum. Don't worry about me, man. I'm just gonna pull the stool from underneath him. Oh, sorry, my bad. My bad. My bad. I'll just go over here. My bad. Sorry. I thought you were just gonna take a seat, dude. You're an old man. Take a seat. Ain't doing anything. Just walking away. No, he's going back to the dartboard. I know. Yes, see, I know. I've seen this one before. I've seen this. Come on, 84%? This download's taking forever! Work, babe. Enjoy work. Guys, I'm gonna twerk it here. Alright, now he's gonna sit down. Oh, no, no, no! No, 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 no! I was about to get it! I was about to get it! 85%. You can do this. Alright. Believe in yourself. Oh no, he sat before I could grab it! Why? Why is my life so cursed? Alright, let's go get the toy boat. Alright, I don't care. Just stop looking at them. Come on. Build up. Let's go. I need this toy boy. This toy boy. Oh yeah. Come on, chase me. Chase me. What are you gonna do? Yeah. Yeah. Come on. Come on. Come on, chicken. Yeah, I called you a chicken. I called you a chicken. What are you gonna do about it? Do I have to? No, it says pint glass and drop in the canal. I don't know how I'm gonna drop into the canal. I got to get the toy boat. Do I have to just get it away from there or what? You guys know? Does anybody know? Is anybody gonna love me? Yeah, she stopped chasing me. So it's free for all. She can't see me underneath her. Oh no, is she gonna put the boat back in? No, she's gonna put the boat back in! Okay. Oh, she's dead. She can't see me. Yes. She can't hit the padding on my feet either, apparently. I'm just gonna hide behind her. You can't see me behind her, right?
I know I haven't called you, and it's been a few months since I tried to. Maybe I'm scared we'll say the wrong thing.
Come on, come on, come on, come on. Nice. Oh, I got the boat. I had the boat earlier!
I'd be happy for you if you say
No!
someone else.
Oh, 91%, guys. We're almost there. This is a long download. It's only been like half an hour.
You've been thinking I moved on, but you should know
She didn't even grab the toy. Oh, come on. You keep trying to drag it away. Yeah, you're old, man. Sit down. Take a break. Your back's hurting. That's what I would do too. I know. I'm an old man. No! Come on. This game cheats! Okay. Oh, sorry, buddy. I'm trying to walk here. Swaddle. No!
This time you've been thinking.
Within you.
Even if I tried, I couldn't.
Nice. Got it. Got it. Man fell on his bum. Man fell on his bum and I win the fun. I forgot how to flap my wings. To be honest. How do I flap my wings? Oh, as X. X is flap. Alright, so I don't know how to break the dartboard. The award of the flower. How do you get awarded a flower? Award of the flower is a goose. Alright, still a pink glass and drop a Mickey now. Set the table. I need a candle and a knife. Okay. Let's go get the knife. I know where the knife is at. Knife's the easiest one at the moment. In my opinion, because without actually knowing the whole game and how to do everything, I know where the knife's at. Yeah, she can't see me. I'm hidden. It's like, oh darn goose! Hide for me too well. Yeah, I know where the pink glasses are, but the pink glasses don't get me anywhere, guys. Not yet, anyways, because I don't know how to get to the canal. All I know is to be loved. Nice, now I just need a candle. I don't know where the candle's at. I'm assuming it's down here in this area. We'll see. What I want. Oh, don't look at me like that. Oh, I know how to get the flower now. Got it. Things are coming together. Oh, well, hold on. How do I do it? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. How about this? Oh, yeah. Check me out, ladies. Check me out. Check me out, ladies. Oh, yeah. Yeah. How do you like that performance, dude? How do you like that performance, dude? They're all laughing at me. What? Come on. Come on. Yeah. Yeah. Come on. Give me the flowers, dude. Give me the flowers. What do I gotta do? What do I gotta do? Yay! Do this? How about this? How about this if I go circles? Oh, yeah! How do you please these ladies? Come on, pretty ladies, give me the pretties. Alright. Alright. Oh, bow? Bow? Oh, yeah, there you go, bow. Bow. How about my wings out? Yeah! Yeah! Oh, got it. I got a flower, yay! Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you a lot. Thank you a lot. Thank you a lot, ladies. You're pretty. Sorry, just go right back to talking. Whoa, dude. No! He kicked me out. I didn't know. Man, that's terrible, man. Alright, let me try this again. Alright. This time, don't press anything. We're at 94% with this download. We're about to get it all night long, guys. We're gonna go Fortnite. We're gonna go Call of Duty. We'll play any game you want as long as it's a good game, you know what I mean? Come on, down, deals. Hey, Ken, what's up, bro? How you doing? Don't mind me here, eating some pie, playing some, Untitled Goose, because Goose is in the house. I can't get out. Run, Ty, run! How's your night going, Ken? Ken? It sounds like I said Ken. Again, how you doing? How's your night? She's taking out the box. The box is like what's the word for it? I can't think of words. So at least I know I can get back in here. So I'm just gonna steal this pint glass real quick. But Ken, how you doing, man? How's your evening? I haven't gotten under this way already. Okay, I was like, how the hell do you get around? This guy's bouncer's mean. Ah, hey, let me out here. Oh no, he broke it! How dare this guy? How dare him? Oh, man, this guy's the worst, Ken. Have you had a chance to play Untitled Goose by any chance? Ken's not even alive. She scared me out of the box. That's what happened. Aha! I made it back into the box. This is step number 1. How to get the pint to the canal? That's a question. I don't even know how to do this, man. This bouncer's hard. Ooh! Is that how I do it? I get carried back out? I don't think that would work, though. I'm a hiding goose. I'm a goose that hides. Oh yeah. Hey, don't chase me. I don't do anything, man. Okay, Ken, how's your night? Can I hop in here? I can't hop in here. I have no clue how I'm gonna break this dartboard. Oh, this dartboard is beyond me right now. But I'm about to play some Fortnite. We're sitting at 96%. How's Ken, how's your night going, man? I'm just sitting here enjoying this lovely stream tonight with some pie. Oh, dude. Who would never believe? I don't know why my delay's at like 2 seconds. Alright, how do you fix that? At that point. How do you fix your delay? It'll be 0 seconds. As close as possible. It's still at 2 seconds. Oh. Oh, yeah, just party down tonight because my life is. See, maybe I can break it when he goes to do the dart. See. Oh no, I messed up. Almost had him. Oh, okay. You're a tough guy to mess with here, man. Yes, I made it! Awesome! Wasn't me, dude. Wasn't me. I didn't do it. What else do I gotta do? Ken, have you played this game, man? Still have paint gas, and that's the only thing I have to do. So this has nothing to do with it? I don't know. Not sure how I'm gonna get this pint glass. Ah! She's chasing me off. She sees me, she chases me off, but otherwise, you're just gonna play. All this work. Come on. Oh no, run, Ty, run. I guess she like shoos me away. What do you think I am? Somebody can shoo away that easily? You're wrong. I'm coming back for my revenge. My goosey revenge. Be forever for seconds. Hey, dude, you're doing good. You're just working. Ah, gotcha, man. You're working right now? I was talking to one of my other streaming buddies. Not as beautiful, my tentacle kin. You never play this game, man? Oh, okay. Okay, you heard me, but you're just gonna respond. Gotcha. I'm a dork. Oh no, he broke the pink glass. Why? Dude, Ken, what do you do for work, man? Let me ask. This game is pretty. It looks fun, but you underestimate how hard this game is. That's what I got. That's the one thing I gotta say about it, because I was watching some people play like some parts of it, like just the clips of it, and I was like, "Yo, this is gonna be so sweet." I love the aspect of this game. The art of this game is amazing. And then I started playing it. I got into like the second puzzle, and I was like, "No, this freaking puzzle game is crazy." That's literally what it is. It's a puzzle game. Watch this. I'm gonna scare her. Oh! I'm stuck in the box. Somebody help me! I'm stuck in the box. Gotta flap my way out of here. Oh. What? I dropped my other pink gas. I need the next pink gas. Come on. Oh no. She's over here cleaning the. Can I get? Oh no, that's the last pink glass I can get. Alright, SOL. Oh no. Okay, fine. I'm out. Haha, sucker. Roma's done with this download. I'm gonna play Fortnite after this. I'm just killing some time until it downloads on my computer. I got tired of trying to switch over for my PS4. I'm like, I got plenty of time, plenty of Oh. Oh no! Why does everyone break the glass? No. He shoos you out good. He's like, nah, you ain't having none of this. I broke all the glasses now. All the glasses are broken. This is what I didn't see. How do I get this out here anyways? Oh, yeah, that's right. I can do this. A free bird! Okay. Oh, is that a quarter? Oh. I wonder what this has to do with anything. No, you can drop it down the wishing well. Let's drop it down the wishing well. Let's see. I'm gonna try to do it. The small things of this game is pretty interesting. There we go. Nothing happened! What? Okay, well I thought it was gonna happen, but it didn't. It didn't happen. I'm so sad now. I was hoping they're like, oh, now make a wish. My wish is to end this game. Is there something I need to do with this? I feel like there's something I need to do with this. Don't look at me like that. She's like so scared of me, but as soon as she can like push me out of the way, she pushes me out of the way. It's so rude. Done with this lady. Someone give me someone nicer. Watch, now she's gotta see that she messed up and left a box. Yeah, you messed the box up. She never learns. She never learns. It's like that one person who dates like, you know, 5, 10 different people and never understood that they should just stop dating and figure out what's wrong with themselves. Wonder why I have all these bad romances. Alright. We're gonna make a break for it. We're making a break for it. I don't need this box anymore. Get me out of here. I won't be cooped up any longer. Come on, there's gotta be another way. Ah! Yeah, I know, you got me. You're hurting me out. I got it. Oh, look, the pink glass is still there. Nice. Oh. No. Pushing me out. This lady's looking at the box like, what? Why is there a box here? Lazy serving. That's what it is. Okay. Does that one lady just help her out? Alright. We're going for the pink glass. Come on. Alright. We got it. We got it. We got this. She doesn't know where we went. She can't tell. Yeah, I'm too smart for you. The goose got a big brain. Goose got a big brain. You can't beat the goose. The goose is a goose. Shake that rump. Rump shanking. Just like a corgi. You're an engineer. Ah. You should talk engineer stuff. Here, I'm turn down the music. What do you engineer though? That's my question. If I didn't tell you, Kim, that's I'm going for engineer management in college right now. So, let's see. Oh, finally, Fortnite is done. It's now available to play. Sweet. Over it out. I have no clue how I'm gonna get this to the canal. Every time I run into this guy, he just bumps me out of the way. Okay. Ow. Alright, see if you chase me. Come on. Chase me. Alright, come on. Nice. Made it! Oh! The sweet relief! Nice! Yeah, dude, I wanna actually... Nice. Well, I didn't mean to fall into the water myself. That was, accidental. I still have to set it. Drop a bucket on the burly man's head. I wonder how I'm gonna do that. But, cool. We'll save this for another time. We'll take this tour. That'd be great. I'll have to play some Fortnite instead. Let's see, is there a way back up there? No, I have to go all the way back. Oh, hold on. Maybe not. Maybe I was thinking too far. I was thinking too deep. What's this? Why is there a pacifier here? Oh, interesting. Okay. There's a boot? Why is there a boot? Oh, I could have opened that forever ago? Oh, that sucks. Now I'm stuck? Is that what they're telling me? So I'm stuck here? It's totally stuck here. I'm not even gonna... Alright, well, we'll quit for now. We're gonna open up this Fortnite world that I've been part of it lately. Let's see, home. No, we're gonna go games. No, library. Fortnite, launch it. Launch that Fortnite remix. Ooh. Yeah, Kikin, if I didn't tell you, but that's what I want to do. I wanna be engineer officially. Don't launch the game there. Launch the game over in this window. Why? Why you have to do this to me? Stare you in the eyes. Real deep in the eyes. Yeah, just chatting. I gotta work on some of the stuff. Let's see. It was supposed to be opening Fortnite. And I feel like it's not opening Fortnite. There it goes. Now it's starting to open Fortnite. Nice. It's loading. Alright, let's see. Ken. At work. Watching streams. Not allowed to sing. How's your doggos doing, Ken? My doggo was begging for attention earlier, and now he's laying and sleeping out in the hall. I'm waiting for this to load all the way so I can at least get into doing what I want to do. Would you like to apply the best settings? No, I don't. Best settings? What do you think I am? Crazy or something? Yeesh. I don't need to see this, thank you. Alright, I need to go to settings. Settings. Window full screen, that's cool. No, I don't want full screen, I want to do window. Yep. Apply. So I can move this over. I want to take it back to full screen. Why? Sweet. Yes, I want to keep those video settings. What? Okay. Interesting. If you didn't know, I'm actually colorblind. Just slightly, not too much. Just enough to give you some love. Alright, so let me hover, and then there it goes. 244 FPS. Resolution. Drop to 250. Brightness. Brightness is fine. Colorblind mode. I need to switch it to. Oh, it's this one. Colorblind strength. Man, why does it seem like everything's off? What's going on? You where emotes are coming? Bro. I'll let you know as soon as possible. Sam's been working on them. We're gonna have some cute emotes, corgi emotes. Dragons. Okay. I didn't know it went that way. Alright. This is my whole colorblind. Hell yeah. Yeah, Sam's working on emotes right now. I can kind of tell you what there are right now. It's gonna be a corgi riding a dragon. Me hugging a corgi, and something else. So we'll see. I hope it'll get sooner than later. We still have to wait for them to approve anyway, so we'll see. 3D resolution? Don't really care about that. Or distance, shadows. I don't care about shadows. Smoother, but can reduce performance. Don't care. I put on medium. So some stuff. Higher effects. Not medium too. Post processing. What's post processing? After scenes are loaded in the game, the images are further processed, improving visual quality. Lowering the setting can raise the frame rate with only minor impact on quality. Using lower resolution also benefits the post processing performance. Okay. Let's do medium, I guess. Motion blur off. No motion blur, thank you. I already get sick enough as is. Draw working across multiple threads, which can dramatically improve performance on multi-core processors. This can cause hitches and lower FPS on weaker hardware. I don't know if my hardware is that weak, bro. But mouse sensitivity. Sensitivity of the mouse, yeah, I know. Can I change it? That'd be great. Man. I don't know where I want it to be, to be honest. I might just play a controller with this, we'll see. I was hoping to do this, aircraft steering. Interesting, okay. Everything seems a little off. What's going on? Because I have to see where I'm hovering. My mouse is supposed to be here, but it's down there. Like, what's even turbo building? Does not tell you. Record replays. Large team replays. Creative mode team replays. Let's see. Now that we're in this. Oh, you guys can't see any of this. Oh, I forgot to set anything. Oh, hold on. I will save you guys. Alright, that's weird. I don't know why I just did that. Oh, my earball. Enable preview. I'm going to add another scene for this. Sorry, this whole Fortnite thing is all spontaneous. I was supposed to play on my PlayStation, and instead it turned out that I had some stuff going on with the PlayStation. And I can't do that. There's a window. We want to catch a Fortnite experience, guys. Catch the Fortnite experience. Let's see. Okay. Now we just need to get the screen. But yeah, I'm looking forward to those emotes. I hope they'll be really dope. I actually think they're gonna be super dope. Let's see. Oh, now it fixed it. Interesting, sort of. It's still a little off in my opinion, but whatever. Let's apply anything I've done, and then escape. Add this. Let's see. Squirrel Chaser's not the one I want to play with. Animal parties. Epic friends. Yo, Squirrelum, where you at? This was on 42 minutes ago. Oh, that was so long ago. So long ago. Oh, that took me that long. I didn't even notice. Yeah. Alright, this is the comet spray. I feel like I already have it on. Alright, well. GG. Nice. You can do bubble GG? Alright, save the next one. Do I have any guns? Skin gun? I don't have any wraps. They call them wraps. Why would they call them wraps? I'm gonna wrap my brain around this game in a second. And the winner is Riley, available now. Great. Guys, you get Riley. I really don't play Fortnite that often. It's taking way too long. Resolution on him looks bad. Everything else looks good. Fine, I will change that too. Wait for Squirrel. Squirrel, where are you? Go spam it. Spam it. Just spam it. Just spam it. Well, let me spam it. Oh. Let's try and escape. Anyways, thanks for sticking around, guys. I appreciate it. That's freaking crazy. I don't know what I'm gonna do with my life. Just play without myself. Play without myself. Yeah, guys, I make a lot of sense, man. All the sense in the world right now. And my office. Whoa, my mouse is off again. Or play with yourself? Yeah, I said that. I said that. You don't need to be judging me, Zenith, okay? Whoa, what? You guys, yourself emotes finally? Congrats, dude. Zenith Gasm. Zenith, we need to talk about this, okay? You might want to talk a little bit about the Zenith Gasm that you're having, okay? Let's see. Party up. I don't want to party up. Can I change the mode? Yeah. Oh, select game mode. There it is. Okay. Hold on. Why? What is going on with my mouse? It doesn't love me. Alright. Hold on. Yeah, see. Hold on. Yeah, it's clicking me places where I don't even be at. I'm about to cry. No, I've never said I was proud. I mean, I would. Can't figure out where I'm clicking. Ah! Look how far this is over. You can see with highlights, it's like that far. It's that far. It's that bad right now. I don't even know how to fix this. I don't even know how to fix this. This is not what I meant. This is why. Guys, I'm having an existential crisis. Help me. Yes, I'm having an existential crisis. Can I use... What can I use to... Ah, come on, seriously? Guys, I'm struggling. Why? I'm struggling! Alright, hold on. Maybe I can just close out of Fortnite altogether. Let's see... Did you draw that by yourself, Santa? Oh, I'm freaking cold. If Squirrel doesn't hop on, I'm gonna shoot her. Sam's like, I'm sad. Should be a Mwah. How's the Rust server going, Zenith? No, it's on the wrong screen again. Why? This game does not love me. I don't know what I fell for, but it's nothing good. That's okay. I think I've had more issues with COD than I've had at Fortnite. Battle Royale. I thought this is early access. What the hell is early access? Yeah, apply. I said apply the windowed. Does this look windowed? Does not look windowed to me. Alright, there you go. Alright, maybe I should just play like this. Alright, it kept all my settings, that's nice. At least everything's accurate now, so it's not hovering like weirdly. Alright, okay, let's play. Let's change the squads first. Maybe I wanna do squads, maybe I wanna do solo. I don't know. We'll just play squads. Let's see if we can squad up with someone. I wonder if I even have I gotta add a friend. Let's see, that's Flo Bert, right? The Flobert? I forgot. Yeah, I forgot his name. I can't believe I forgot his name, guys. Jeez. Oh, did I need to reset this? Yeah, I need to reset this. I thought. What is going on? Whoa. There's a lot of screaming going on in the background there. Going on, how's the night?
No, we're not going there. Watch, you're gonna die. Fine. What?
Downpour? What's that? Oh, that's downpour.
Bobby.
Easy there, buddy. I don't know what my talk is.
I'm not done yet. I just complete one challenge. Oh, pretty easy. I did that.
Yeah,
What? Sure, it's easy. It's called, you have to
Down bar.
pretend a second
I'm gonna have to mute these poor kids.
by somebody, and then
These guys are gonna kill me.
seconds, and then that's the challenge.
Ah, I can't. I forgot how all these buttons work on
Oh,
PC. Not that I even knew. To be honest. Oh. Oh man, the shooting outside already. Somebody save me. I need guns. Why is this basement so long? I'm scared right now for my health, guys. My life. I don't have Squirrel to save me. I don't have any guns, man. What the heck? What is he doing over there?
yeah.
Alright. 2. Come on. 2. Drink it. Drink it. Okay, apparently I don't know how any PC works whatsoever. You're crazy, I'm actually doing decent for once. I'm at about 4. Nice. What do you mean you're doing decent for once? You mean like, personally decent or what? Nice. Oh. That's a lot of damage! I could get some wood. Zaneth, how you been, dude? What do you mean you've been okay and been crazy decent for once? This guy was shooting things. Full action sniper rifle. Oh, I got 2 pistols. When did I get 2 pistols and didn't notice?
Don't get me! What the heck are you doing?
It's my teammates dying already?
What the heck?
Oh, dude, this is what you do. This is what happens when you play against kids, man. Or with kids. Oh. Oh. No! Chapter spoon? Oh, fork knife? What? Ah, oh, fork knife. Yes, I'm playing old fork knife. Did you not realize that? Like I got lucky. I was panicking. I'm like, I don't play enough on this. Hold on. Oh, I hate this. You can't just go back. You have to return to lobby and then not spectate, but ready up. But chapter spoon. What do you mean chapter spoon? Zenith, you're confusing me. Never show me that again. I would appreciate that. Thank you. Let's see. No channel. No, I don't want to be a party. I want friends only. There we go. That changed. What? Settings. Audio. Sound quality high. 3D headphones. I do have headphones, but I can't use that because I don't want that. I want visual sound effects. Yes. Voice chat on. Push to talk. Let's put push to talk. Input device. I want to be. What do I want it to be? I forget. I guess I could do that, technically. I forget what my settings are set up on. And I still don't understand why you said chapter spoon, Zenith. Totally lost me there, bud. Oh yes, this chat, this output is. There you go. Input is the output of that. Voice channel filter matched. Voice chat notifications. Sure. Default is set to default. And I can hear it, so we're fine with that. Gonna do that. Escape backwards. I am not finding presence known. Unknown. Playing Battle Royale. Duos. 11 left. Nice. Spam this. I want to just spam this. Come on. Let me spam it! Where are you, seahorse? Try not to die right here, there. Try not to die, be right there. What do you mean be right there? Dude, I'm gonna die. Oh, Fork Knife is gonna get me. And are you even, I don't even have you added an Activision or anything like that, so. I have to add you, if that's what you're meaning. I'm definitely dying, dude. I already died. I already died. I'm already dead. I gotta move this train on, along. Should play, some COD. That's what I want to play. Some good old COD. Oh, you know, I didn't even change my game setting. Ah, my bad. BB. I'm not a Fortnite player, alright? I only play so much. Oh, this guy's straight up. Whoa, bro. Back off, man. You don't know what you're messing with, man. You don't know what you're messing with, because I don't know what I'm messing with. Unable to edit building. What am I? What? How do you even dance? Bro, do you even dance? Do you even dance, bro? Do you even dance? Dance, bro? Do you even dance? What are my controls again? I don't know my controls. Somebody save me.
Why am I a cowboy?
I don't know, man.
Okay, I want to listen to this. I'm just gonna listen.
It's left shift, yeah, okay. Equals auto run. Oh. Crouch, left control. Okay, target. Oh crap! I gotta jump? No! Where am I supposed to jump? I'm screwed!
Guys!
Yeah. Yeah, you're over there. I'm over here, dude.
I'm landing Pleasant. Good luck, I'm here looking at going Pleasant.
Oh, yeah.
Logan now. Because I don't want
Yeah. Yeah, we're going retail row. Yeah, let's do it. Retail row. Alright, how do I get out of this?
We're running retail. Logan's too dumb and he's landing retail.
We're gonna die in retail. Die! Playing with a bunch of kids. Again.
Are you?
I'm not who you think I am. Oh, there's one guy over here. Crap. This guy have a gun. Oh no. There's a couple of people outside. Done. I'm leaving you guys. I'm out.
It is Logan.
I don't know. Someone keeps asking where Logan is, and I don't know who Logan is. I'm just poor. Oh, someone's downstairs. No. We're gonna die. What am I gonna do? Guys, help me.
I do feel like I'm gonna die.
Yes. I will die.
Where even are you, Logan? I'm at retail.
There's
Logan,
a lot going on right now. I'm super concerned.
oh, he's in retail somehow.
Oh no, they got me! There's 3 squads of squids over here! Why? I'm out! Dude, guys, I died! Oh, this guy has a cool skin! Ringing Logan. How do I change people? Oh, there you go. Next teammate. Ringing Logan.
I need help.
8 Jupiter. Why do these kids got all these cool skins, man?
Kids, I'm not
I-
gonna kill myself. Stop it, Logan.
Are they gonna save me? I doubt they're gonna save me. How much you guys want to bet he's not gonna save me? I'm gonna die. Ah!
I need to be in the trash. Where's my trash?
I don't.
Come here. Grayson,
Where's my controls?
look,
Where's my audio?
look at
I did push the talk, and I forgot what the push the talk was.
Dad, look at my.
Push the talk.
I'm getting my new house. Think I got big money.
I just shut them up for a second. they totally lost their minds.
I don't know where it is.
Where's my voice, dude? Fly down. I don't know. Guys, I don't know what's going on. What is my push the talk set to? Bum 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 bum. Yo, they're being fired at. You guys can hear the fire? The fire! Push the talk is T. Okay. I have a substitute.
What?
Oh man. Alright, let's go return to lobby. I didn't think they're gonna save me anyways. I should have left. Sam says she's loved me. I don't believe her. I don't believe you, Sam. Alright. Omega? Who's Omega? I don't know who Omega is. I just Joe Squirrel hasn't come yet. I switched to play Fortnite. What do you mean Omega's playing? Yes. This is presence unknown. What the hell's presence unknown? Joinable parties is plus 8 others. Just randomly hop in. So randomly hop in and join the party. I don't know what they're doing. There's plus 8 other people. It seems scary. Bum, 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 12 hours. 12 hours. 12 hours. I just gotta find another one. Did you bring a snack? Cause I'm about to snap back. You can't believe it, cause I'm gonna snap back. Da na 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 na. Na 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 na. Can you guys help me? Cause I'm out of my mind. I'm gonna take this wheelchair down a little 5. Oh, oh. Oh, oh. Take an enemy fighter. Remember to build some cover. I guess I could. I guess I could have built myself some cover and I didn't think that. What's the C do? I haven't checked to see what C does. So I can set up exactly like COD, and then I can just get used to the controls. C. Oh, let's see what C does now. Builds a wall. I mean, a staircase in this case. And then E, no, Q. Q, okay. Oh. Is it map? Yeah, we got M for map. Let's go Frenzy Farm. They all pick Frenzy Farm. They're like, yeah, why not? Let's just pick Frenzy Farm. Like, you guys are dorks. Yo. Yeah, let's get into this house. Got a med kit and stuff, nice. What's this over here? Alright. Anything good here? Oh, burst rifle? Oh yeah, let's take that. Let's take that. You guys ready to get lit in here? Ready to get lit in here? Alright, alright. Oh nice. Some ammo. Ammonos. I keep pressing the crouch button. Oh yeah. Oh, the shotgun, nice. How did I miss the shotgun? Oh no, because I just came from the top. Nice. Alright, alright. Let's get it. Hype in here like ninja. Cause I got no ninja skills. Oh, a beautiful sniper rifle. Oh, I just. Oh yeah. How did you pin me? There you go. Aha! Aha! I got the skills now! No one's gonna stop me! I'm the master of disguise! Alright, alright, alright. Anybody need an assault rifle? There's an assault rifle up here. Come get your assault rifle. Come get your assault rifle. Oh, is that something important? Oh, that's a grenade. Oh, I don't want the grenade for a sniper rifle. That'd be crazy! Okay. Oh, there's some rocket up there. Okay. Rocket ammo. That's the word. I forgot words, guys. There's an assault rifle over here. This guy. A burst rifle. No one cares about any of that stuff. Nobody cares. It's just you, Ty. Ooh. That's zoom, guys. That's zoom. Think you're down 1,000 yards, man. What? What's going on? Try to run and it won't let me run. Why do I hear? Why am I always hearing someone's like TV going on in the background? Why am I always playing with kids in this game? Nice. Let's go swap this. Oh no, that's not what I meant to do. I meant to do this. There you go. Nice. Now I got some decent weapons. I still don't have. Oh, you know, I mean, I just noticed I had the shield potion. Nice. I forgot you can't move while doing this. Everybody needs some shield. Oh, my shield limit is reached. It's reached its infinite max ability. Alright, alright. Let's destroy everything. You don't need any of this stuff. I mean, they don't need it anymore. The world's post-apocalyptic, alright? Gonna get this Fortnite down on us. Down on. I know, Zeta said something about like coming back or don't die or something, and I'm totally confused, dude. I mean, don't die because of Fortnite? So Fortnite? I mean, I'm gonna die regardless, dude. I die all the time. Yo, they got some machine gun over here. No one said anything? What's wrong with you, man? Just gonna get all the wood I need. Give me all the wood, man. I think we're like smack dab in the middle of the circle, too. Let's look for Izzy. Forever Izzy's! Just destroying everything. They don't need this stuff, right, guys? We'll just take whatever we can get and get away with it, right? Yeah, I'm gonna take this. Okay. So they never knew anything was here. It's always been an empty room. Alright? Maybe I should fix my, my ability to sprint right now. Because apparently I can't sprint, Oh, sprint is left control. I don't know why it doesn't seem like like it. Let's see. Yeah. Alright. 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 Well, we're just having fun chilling here. People clicking things, saying hello. Alright, yeah, I'm fine with going that way. Alright, I'm hitting left control. I'm not really running. I think the game's broken. Is it toggled? I don't know. Apparently I can't sprint very far or fast. One or two. Technical shotgun. Nice. They're running. These guys are gone. They took the long way. Supercharged until level 15. Nice. Or knocked out with shotgun. What's the Demondis doing, man? Where is everybody at right now? Okay, apparently those guys decided to stay there. Whatever. So I'm not running. Now I'm running. I don't know. That makes any sense, guys. I'm freaking lost in this game. Why? Oh, I was gonna open that up, man. Nice. All right, I got a grenade. I've got a grenade. I'm not afraid to use it. Ooh, some objects make great houses. Climb inside. Yeah. Survivor medal. Nice. Goose. Who wants to get a piece of this sniper? Give it to me. Oh, what's that? It's a shiny gun. Anybody got shield pots? Is that another weapon? Is that another weapon I missed? Oh, let's go get it. Let's go get this weapon. Yeah, I know how to hide. See? Hid. Stop hiding. Oh, there's stuff in the... Okay. Can we get some love here? Like... Oh. Nice, a submachine gun that's blue. I'll take it. Let's see, you guys. Storm shrinking. We're like I picked a great spot. I spent this whole game just chilling out on Frenzy Farm. Whoa, boys. That's our cover you're taking away. Blizzard concealment. You can just head in here. No one known where you were at. Until it's too late. You know? But nah, these guys are like, fools, we take down everything. Nothing exists. You gotta set up our ambush here. While we can. Yeah, I don't care about the fishing rod, dude. Oh, I just heard something. Heard something. Something happened. Someone should be taking pop shots. Taking pop shots? I don't know why that guy's going all the way over there. Whoop. Let's see. Is there anybody out here? I feel like I get sick just looking at the screen. Oh, shooting, eh? I'm gonna let you guys take out my friends like that. Come on. You got us, Ty? You got this, Ty? Yo, they're making some big money over there. Dude, I just took off like half that fucking shade there, man. Got some shade going on in this place. Come on, guys. Come on, you can do it. I have faith in you. Nice, they got him. Oh, shoot. Oh, crap. Oh, behind me. It's behind me. Oh, no, why? Oh, hey, there's one guy over here. One guy over here. Oh, next teammate. What's that?
We're going to.
Yeah, Demon Dice, you're going the right way. He was somewhere over here. He went to the right. He went to the right, I think. He may have gone towards the farmhouse. Come on, guys, reboot me! Let's go! Let's go! I haven't done any damage yet. That squirrel had to go do something. That's why she's not shot. Right in front of you! Right in front of you! Oh, dude, what are you doing, man? You just put down all sorts of shit. Oh, dude. Teammate down. This guy is not the brightest.
Nobody.
Oh, run it, man. Run it, Tifo Tone. Tifo Tone. Come on, Tifo Tone. You can do it. You can do it.
Triple team.
Oh. Triple team. We're all done for. We're all done for. We're not gonna make it, guys. We're not gonna make it. We're not gonna make it. This is why I have a hard time playing Fortnite.
There's like 100 and something other people in the world.
Nice. Higher bounce. I don't think he's gonna be able to take him. TF Tone? 83? You got a 1v4 these guys? 1v4 these guys?
Wait, where's his reboot card? Get his reboot.
Easy. Yeah, it's in the house there. Yeah, right there, I think. The shed, yeah.
Run.
Good job, thanks.
If he reboots us, I swear.
Okay, now we do it. And if you do this,
Shut up, Nano. Oh shit, the storm.
10% of my power. And break.
We're all gonna spawn with pistols.
Oof.
Okay, now it's time to kill other people. Who's on me?
Oh hell no!
Get behind the van. Oh! GG, guys. Let's play 7. Oh. Turn the lobby. Honestly, I'm feeling a little bit more like COD right now, you know what I mean? I think my dog's passed out. My girlfriend should be home soon. It goes. It goes. We go all night long. You guys never know. Yes, we're gonna leave. We're gonna change this up to the COD right now. Set. Can't get enough to snack me back. Boy, what have you done? Boy, what have you done? Big Sam's here. Why? I don't know. Try not to die, be right there. No clue. Rust. I think Zenith messaged the wrong person. Oh, oh. Waiting for us to. Whoa, oh, 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 oh. It's gonna go. Yeah. Oh, 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 oh. It's gonna be that it's gonna be. Way. I gotta go. Oh, hitting 40% CPU and hitting red. Whoa. Drop down frames like normal. Pro. Ah, man, come on. A freaking shader. Ah. Alright guys, I'll be back. I think. Hold on. Maybe I'll Sorry guys, I'm just waiting here and trying to figure out how to get COD to update without being a pain in the butt. I've been a pain in the butt. Batukas. Streaming all day, streaming all night, what you gonna do about me? Who? Oh, maybe it's that way time? Oh, not done. How you guys like it when I sing? Does it make you happy? No, not what I wanted. Tried that, not letting me do that. Alright, we'll try this one more time. Call of Duty's gonna kill me. One of the days, it's gonna kill me. I'm never gonna get away. Somebody help me. I'm a dying. Come on, COD, let's play. Come on down, let's play. I cannot find it now. All the times, I cannot find what I need. Ba 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 ba. Here you go. Firewall. Brains on the fire. Brains on fire. Why is it on fire? Can't handle this burning wood pyre. Help me. Why don't you just help me? Okay. My server's been disconnected? Why? Why? Yes. Disconnect and go back. Because you're just killing me right now. Guys, I'm pregnant. I forgot to tell you guys, I'm pregnant. I'm pregante. Wanted you guys to know. Be the first ones to know. Alright? So I just hope you guys will be there for me. I will post the whole list for my baby. It's mostly consists of food. I need bacon, egg, and cheese breakfast sandwich in the morning. Pizza for lunch. And a nice good steak at dinner time, alright? Sound good? Update! They already have an update! Why? Alright, I'm gonna come back.